What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I paint the off-white armor of my Necrons. In order to make these videos as informative as possible, I have included as much of the painting process as necessary. However, in the interest of cutting down on the video time and length, I have chosen to speed up these parts. If you want to skip these parts and just jump to the next step, you can use the timestamp links in the video description below. So to do the armor on my Necrons, you're going to need 4 primary colors and 1 off color for your battle damage. So the base color we're going to be using is US Olive Drab from Vallejo. And then for all of our highlights, we're working through scale colors using Thar Brown and Mojave White. And then we do our final edge highlights with White Sands. We're also going to be using Burnt Red from Vallejo to do our weathering patterns, our chip weathering. And to apply that, you're also going to need some blister pack foam. I apply this using some tweezers, but you can get away with just using your fingers and just sponging it on. So I'm going to demonstrate this on the back panel of this piece that goes on the back of the dais. So it slots in right here. And the first thing I want to think about is how I'm going to be applying my light and shadow. So the way this piece fits in, slotted in the back, we're getting our light on this panel coming in from this direction. So we're going to have it on the top a little bit over here, but it's going to be almost the brightest along this panel. And we're not going to get much light back here and definitely not back here. So when I do this demonstration, you're going to see that I'm focusing most of my highlighting on this panel, and I do just a little bit to add a bit more color back here, so it's not just a flat olive drab. I've also gone ahead and just base coated olive drab onto this piece just to avoid wasting time showing you how to do a base coat, which everyone should know how to do. And really this entire exercise is just practicing layering and a bit of wet blending. We're going to be taking US Olive Drab and adding progressive amounts of first our Thar Brown, and then working our way up by adding more Mojave White as well, until we reach almost pure Mojave White in our highlights. Now you can see I'm not diluting my paint too much. I already have some water on my brush, and I'm working with a wet palette that has some moisture on it already. And with these colors, I find that's pretty much all the dilution I need. I also work pretty quickly at this stage because one, I want the textures of my brush strokes to show through. It helps to add a bit of the unevenness to the arm panels, and it helps to simulate a bit of weathering. And it's also because I go back in with some glazes and filters afterwards to help smooth out my blends. And so I'm not too worried about getting perfect blends out of the gate with my layering. So I've done my first pass. It's still a little wet, so it's reflecting on the camera. I apologize, but you can see how I've brightened up a little bit of this part of the panel right here because of the way the armor curves and divots a little bit. This line right here, I want to be my darkest point, or where all of my deeper olive drab shows through. And I want a little bit of the armor panel as it flares out this way to receive a little bit of my highlights. So from this point on, I'm not going to bother touching this back face. I'm happy with pretty much where that's going to be, and I'm going to focus all of my blending and highlighting on this panel. And now that I've got my highlights up to pretty much pure Thar Brown, I'm now going to start taking my Mojave White and adding it into my Thar Brown to go up to my brightest points. Now, because this is on the lower part of the dais and because this is, once again, a back element, I'm not going to be taking my Mojave White to, I'm not going to be covering a large area with the Mojave White. So if I want to pull in something like this as an example, on a lot of these more forward elements, especially on the front legs, the talons, the head, you can see that I've gone fairly bright on a larger surface. So like right around here, I'm pretty much at pure Mojave White. This large area over here, pure Mojave White. I'm not going to be going quite as bright on the lower portion of the dais on this back panel. So I'm probably going to limit my brightest point highlights to this top surface and some of this paneling right here, and then maybe a little bit down here and along this panel. This front plate also curves and it dips in, flares in, much like this back panel does. So this part right here along this sharp edge should be receiving more light. It should be just a little bit brighter if my light source is coming from this direction than this plane on the leg right there. So that's something to keep in mind depending on where the piece sits on the model, especially if you're painting in sub-assemblies, and then especially on a big model like this where the dais is a fairly lower portion element. And there's going to be this massive piece that sits on top where I know it's going to be brighter up here. I don't want the brightness to be uniform all the way around. I want the brightest point of the model to be on top, and then working my way down, it's darker and darker and darker. So even on these front talons or these front armor portions of the dais, because it is lower, I haven't gone to pure Mojave White on a lot of portions. Really, I've just focused it along these brightest points where I want a little bit of attention, where I want it to still maintain that ivory color, but without fighting the rest of the model for contrast. So once again, we're just going to be layering up our paints. We're just taking Thar Brown and mixing in progressive amounts of Mojave White. Once again, I'm using a wet palette that keeps the paint fairly moist, so I don't need to dilute it too much. One thing to always keep in mind as well when you're painting in sub-assemblies, always keep parts of the model on hand, especially as you're painting it. It's always useful to start comparing how you're placing your highlights, how bright or how dark they are relative to some of the other parts of the model, it's very easy to take one piece in isolation, overpaint it, and then bring it back to the model and realize, oh, I've taken my highlights too bright, or I haven't deepened my shadows far enough. So it's always useful periodically to just double check, compare it to the original or the rest of the model, and find out exactly how far you want to take it. So I'm fairly happy with this. I think I've gone as bright as I want to relative to where this piece sits on the model. Now, of course, if you're painting something that sits more forward or you want to go a little brighter, you're going to spend more time working your way up through the Mojave White, adding more of it to the model to just brighten up, or how adding more of those highlights to make the piece brighter than it actually would be on this part of the dais. So now that we've worked up our shadows and our highlights from Olive Drab, Thar Brown, and Mojave White, it's time to go back in and smooth out some of these transitions. So to start, we're going to take a mix of our Thar Brown and Mojave White, and then we're just going to dilute it into a nice little glaze. And then we're going to start finding some problem areas that we want just to be a little smoother, or we find the transitions to be a little too sudden. And we're just going to lightly glaze them back. This is also a good part of, or a good time to correct some of your overpaints. So you'll see over here where I've sort of overpainted a little bit with some of my highlights. I can go back in with just Olive Drab and tighten up that line, that edge. Similarly, in these where these armor plates separate, I overpaint a little bit, so I just go back in with my Olive Drab and I'm correcting. Now, there's not too many glaring issues on this particular blend that I've done, and so this glazing step will be fairly quick. But just take your time. I'm mixing progressive amounts of Olive Drab into my glaze, so it gets darker and darker as I go, until I'm just glazing pure Olive Drab in some of my deepest shadows. And then once I'm happy with the smoothness of the transitions, I'll stop and we'll move on to our next step. And that's the base color, our shadows and highlights applied to the armor. We're going to apply this to the reverse side, and then I will show you how I do my highlighting and weathering. Okay, so now that we've painted both sides of the armor and we're happy with the way the blend looks, we're happy with the lights and shadows, it's time to do our highlighting and our weathering. So the first step that I usually do before I do my chip weathering is I highlight all of the armor panels. I highlight all the edges. So for this, we're going to use Mojave White and White Sands. Normally, I use only White Sands because it's the brightest, or it's the brightest color in all the steps, and I can be sure that no matter where I put it, it's going to be fairly bright. However, because the back portion of this armor plate is fairly dark, I think pure White Sands is a little too bright and it might look a little too stark. So I'm going to go back in and highlight the back portions just a little bit with the Mojave White color, which is a little darker. It won't be quite as sharp, and I think it'll still sell the effect. I do it on some of these back armor panels too. It's a subtle thing. You don't really notice it unless you're really closely paying attention. But so, for example, on this back leg, I've highlighted maybe this lower portion with the Mojave White and this top portion with White Sands. Similarly, right here, this top element is White Sands, and this bottom is the Mojave White. It's a little subtle thing. It makes it feel less stark, and as long as we keep our highlights sharp and apply them in a way that makes sense, um, it'll all come together. So since I already have my Mojave White on the palette, we're going to start with that color. And really what we're going to be using is we're just going to be using the flat end of the brush with our diluted paint. And we're just going to gently drag it across the edge. Now, I'm not going to go all the way down because the way it sits, it doesn't make much sense for light to be coming from this direction. You might get a little bit of reflected light from the back or from ambient around, so that's why I like to pick out some of these raised elements on top here. And then we're very carefully going to highlight the top of these armor panels. Now, because this top surface gets more direct light, and similarly this panel is getting the most direct light, I'm going to be using white sands to highlight the front of this. Something to keep in mind as well with the new Necrons, and it's particularly egregious in the Szarekh model in his dais, but it's a problem with all of them. They've sculpted a lot of battle damage into the model already. So a lot of the armor plates, and particularly the edges, are uneven. They've sculpted in these dips and divots and turns in the edges of the armor so that they're not perfectly sharp. So you have to be very, very careful when you're edge highlighting that you don't slip with your brush and highlight too much. So for example, right there, that dip is a sculpted part of the model. And if you were just to drag your brush across willy-nilly, you might have highlighted the entire surface, including the dip. So you need to be careful as you're painting these models of the newer Necrons that you're not over highlighting some of this battle damage, or that you're highlighting appropriately. And then they've also sculpted some of this cracking and these missing parts in the armor, so we're going to highlight those as well. Nothing on the other side. And then we're going to switch to our white sands, and we're going to highlight some of the brighter portions of the armor. And the reason that we're doing these edge highlights first is once we've done our sponge weathering, it's much harder to go back in and maintain or highlight some of these edges without potentially covering up or having to work around this chipping. So what I like to do to help speed up the process and make it a little easier for me in terms of not having to go back in and correct mistakes or to be super careful when I'm highlighting afterwards. I like to highlight all of the sharp edges, all the main points of the armor first. And then once I've done my chip weathering, my sponging, when I go back in, all I'm highlighting are the chips. I don't have to worry about highlighting the edges of the armor afterwards. So it's these little things. It's not a huge amount of time if you're only painting a couple of pieces here and there. But when you're painting an army, when you're grinding out a lot of pieces, saving little bits or little amounts of time here and there, like 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there, adds up when you're painting 10, 20, 30 models. So once again, we're just using, where we can, the edge of our brush, and we're highlighting these edges carefully and sharply, paying attention to where Games Workshop has, in their infinite wisdoms, decided to sculpt damage on. So that's our first highlighting pass on the armor. So with that done, it's time to go and do our chipping. So to do this, we're going to be using blister pack foam. You want foam that's fairly stiff. You don't want soft foam. There's a bit of a difference in the texture of it, especially when you tear it. Soft foam tends to compress very easily, and it doesn't give the individual flex that we're really looking for. So you want stiff foam, just tear off a little bit, and you want a textured side. You want something that's a bit uneven and rough. And we're going to pick that part to use for our sponging. The reason I'm using squeeze to open tweezers is just easier to hold. It's easier to maneuver this sponge, this little tiny piece, all around the model as opposed to doing it by hand. So to do this, we're just going to take our burnt red from Vallejo. I already have some loaded on my palette from last night. We're just going to apply a bit with the sponge and we're going to dab off most of it. So we're almost approaching it like a dry brush. Not quite as dry as a dry brush. We still want some paint on the model. But when we're dabbing it on the palette, we want to see those nice dots. We want to see a nice pattern of chipping and of the flecking. And if it's not, find a new part of the sponge, tear it up a bit more, or get a different piece. When we go to apply to the model as well, we have to think about how is the damage being created, or how is it being inflicted, as it were, on the model. So this dais, this piece is one of the back parts of the dais. It sits on the back. Not a lot of enemy fire is coming in from the front, and for me, I don't retreat. He's not going backwards, so I'm not going to be seeing too much damage coming from the rear either. I will, however, see quite a lot of chipping coming from underneath, where ground debris and explosions are happening beneath him, or where he's potentially crashing on the ground as he's moving across the terrain. So really, we're going to be focusing our sponging on the bottom of this panel and a little bit from the front, but not a whole lot. And then we're also going to tap just a bit on the top where some of the, I guess the fire or the debris might be passing through exposed parts of the dais. And at this part, you can go as heavy or as light as you want. Think about the narrative that you want to tell. Think about the overall look that you want to have for the model, and then sponge accordingly. I always recommend to go slow, sponge a bit, take a step back, give it a look over, compare it to the rest of the model, and see how you feel about it. This is one of those where it's very easy to go back in and add a little more each time, but it's very difficult to take back. Once you've sponged it on, to correct it, you're going to have to repaint most likely a large part of the armor, and that's something we don't want to do. That's just extra work that's unnecessary. So I'm fairly I'm fairly happy with this. It's not too much, it's not over the board, but it's enough to add a little bit more texture, a little bit more information to this part of the armor. So with this step done, it's now time to go back and add our final highlights. And once again, we're just using White Sands and Mojave White and highlighting it as we did the rest of the armor. All the chip weathering on this part is going to be highlighted with White Sands. Anything back here, we're going to use Mojave White. You don't have to highlight every single chip and every single splatter. I'm only really focusing on some of the bigger ones. Those are the ones that I feel are going to be the most, or the deepest, and will catch the most light. It's at this point as well that I'm going to start adding or thinking about surface scratches, and I'm just going to go ahead and add random lines with my highlight color as I feel. So basically, wherever I feel like there should be a little more um, surface imperfection, either from battle damage or just what have you, I'm throwing in some lines, some chips, some dots, just to add a bit more information, a bit more texture to it. I try not to go too overboard. I'm really focusing on where I think there needs just to be a little bit more information on the model, if I want to add a bit more point of interest. And just be careful to keep your lines sharp. You don't want your highlights to be overly thick because it ruins the illusion and it makes it look more like a camo pattern than highlights on battle damage. And as always, pay attention to where your light source is and highlight accordingly. That's what really sells the effect, especially on a large model like this. If all of your highlights are consistent, it really makes the entire thing look much more convincing, which is always one of the challenges of painting in sub-assemblies, is keeping your light sources, your brights and your darks consistent across the entire model, across every piece. You can see that I'm also using some of my rougher brushstrokes to help guide or inform where I might be throwing in some of these scratches or extra highlights that aren't on any of the chip weathering. If I find that a brushstroke is particularly egregious, or if I feel like it looks very convincing as a bit of damage, I may go and throw a highlight around it to really help sell the effect. I'm not really planning a lot of this damage beforehand. I'm sort of just applying it as I go and seeing how I feel. It's a very organic process, and I'll be honest, it can be very zen, especially when you're 3 or 4 or 5 hours in painting the same figure. You're just doing chipping and battle damage across a large surface. It's helpful to just zone out and just appreciate the zen of it. When I was painting the Szarekh heavy construct, that happened a lot. He had a lot of armor, a lot of very big pieces, and I found that it hit a point where it was very relaxing painting that model, very zen. And that's it. It's a very simple and easy recipe to paint the armor. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to check out the other videos in my Necron Szarekh series. Don't forget to subscribe for more awesome weekly content, and to check out my Instagram as John the Ho for daily updates on my hobby projects. Until next time, happy hobbying.